Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, all by way of distilling lessons from them that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today is just 2 days shy of the 57th anniversary of the start of the Tet Offensive, one of, if not the biggest battle in the Vietnam War, lasted for a month or so. And it really was the turning point for that particular conflict. And you know, in any battle that's so important to a war, for example, the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, or the invasion in Normandy, the Battle of Guadalcanal, going back to World War I, the elimination of the San Miguel salient. So there are these kinds of pivotal events. By the way, the Battle of New Orleans that we talked about earlier this year, in the War of 1812, a battle that happened, is, if you saw that episode, after the war had actually ended, but because communication in the early 19th century was not what it was today, the combatants didn't know the war was over. So anytime we have such a consequential battle, it's really an opportunity for us to, first of all, learn something about human conflict, but then also to find lessons to apply in our professional lives. So I've mentioned this many times. I don't think of business as the kind of existential human endeavor the way war is. But nonetheless, business oftentimes involves conflict. It happens at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. And so there are many connections we can make. And two, and I've been thinking about this quite a bit. I'm in the midst of reading two classic books, both of them fictional works. One is The Bostonians by Henry James, and the other is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. And one of the things that strikes me about both of these books, which were written in the late 19th century, is how much they have to say about what's happening in the world, and in particular in the United States today. So the idea that that fiction has nothing to teach us, which is, I think, a belief held by a lot of people, and especially classic literature, I think is a mistake. We need to look at what happens when human beings conflict, in order to learn better how to deal with those conflicts, and perhaps more importantly, how to avoid those conflicts. So getting back on track now, get off my soapbox. So as I mentioned, the Tet Offensive began on January 30th, 1968. It was a surprise attack by the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong, the VC, which was essentially a guerrilla group within North Vietnam, and against the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which was the South Vietnamese Army and United States forces. And like I said, it was a surprise attack on over 100 cities, towns, and military bases throughout South Vietnam, including Saigon, which was the capital of South Vietnam, and Hue, which was a historic city. And one among the key targets was the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, which actually was temporarily breached, which was just shocking to Americans and really people around the globe that the embassy of the most powerful country, or at least one of the most powerful countries in the world, could be breached by the NVA and the VC. Over 80,000 communist troops were involved, making it the largest military campaign of the Vietnam War. And the purpose of the attack was to incite the South Vietnamese South Vietnamese civilians to rise up against the U.S.-backed government in South Vietnam, and in essence kind of join with the North Vietnamese in kicking out the South Vietnamese regime, and hence the United States, and uniting the country under North Vietnamese rule, making it, one Vietnam. Now, the reason it's called the Tet Offensive is it began during the Vietnamese lunar holiday known as Tet, which was traditionally a time when the forces were under a truce, okay, and hence the surprise nature of the attacks. So the city of Hue, this historic city I mentioned, was the scene of some of the fiercest fighting, and it lasted nearly a month. And during the communist occupation of Hue, thousands of suspected South Vietnamese government sympathizers were killed at what became known as the massacre at Hue. Now, notwithstanding that the South Vietnamese and the U.S. forces were caught by surprise, they were able to regroup and counterattack. And although it took some heavy fighting, eventually most of the towns and cities were retaken. And so, in terms of a tactical battle, the North Vietnamese really didn't get anything out of it. And indeed, and I'm going to talk about the casualty figures here in just a minute, they paid a huge price for mounting the Tet Offensive, for really little, if any, territorial gain. So, and I remember as a kid, so I was 7 years old when the Tet Offensive was launched, not quite 7.5 years old. And I remember watching on our black and white TV in the evening news. My parents watched Walter Cronkite, the great newscaster of that time, and the casualty figures would be brought up on the screen each night. And they always seemed to follow the same pattern, which was there'd be X number of U.S. killed and wounded. There'd be roughly like 2 to 5 times X the number of South Vietnamese troops killed and wounded. And then there would be kind of a 10 times or 20 times or more X number of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops killed and wounded. And in the Tet Offensive, these numbers played out really exactly that way. So there were between 1,100 and 1,600 Americans killed in the Tet Offensive, and about 7,000 to 8,000 wounded. With respect to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese, so There are about 2,300 to 2,800 killed in action, what were called KIAs, and between 5 and 6,000 wounded. So, you know, much, about double the number killed, around the same number wounded. But with respect to the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, and the Viet Cong, killed in action was estimated at between 40 and 50,000, right? So a factor of roughly 40 times, 30 to 40 times the number of Americans, and 20 times the number of South Vietnamese. There's never been, at least that I could find, any kind of accurate figure on the number of wounded NVA and VC, likely tens of thousands more. And in fact, the losses were so large that they basically destroyed is too hard a word, but they really weakened the Viet Cong as a fighting force. And thereafter, the North Vietnam really had to rely on the NVA as the war continued, and did indeed continue for several more years. So again, huge, tens of thousands of troops killed and wounded, little territorial gain, the major disabling of the Viet Cong, right? By any measure, a strategic loss for the North Vietnamese, and a pretty remarkable turn of events by the South Vietnamese and the U.S. forces. And yet, the Tet Offensive was a significant, despite the defeat, the Tet Offensive was really a significant psychological victory for North Vietnam. First of all, the U.S. government had been projecting a very optimistic picture of the war up to that point, and the surprise attack and the large losses, 1,000 to 1,600 U.S. troops killed, and 5 times that wounded in one battle, that really undermined the American public's confidence in the information that was coming out of the American government about the war, and in particular the progress. The breaching of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, as I'm sure you can imagine, dramatically undermined this idea that the war was progressing on American terms. And as well, the images of violence, in particular, there was the execution of a Viet Cong prisoner in Saigon that was covered by the media, really intensified the anti-war sentiment in the United States. So we tend to think of the Vietnam War in the context of Americans were always against the war. That was not the case at all. The majority of Americans were in favor of the Vietnam War. For the first several years, there was kinetic combat. Now, there were advisors in Vietnam from the time of Eisenhower, and then Kennedy, President Kennedy, upped the number of advisors, and then eventually it spilled over, and became, when it became a hot war, America sent combat troops, ships, planes, etc., to support the South Vietnamese government. So. And Americans largely supported the war, and it was really in the beginning a somewhat radical fringe that opposed the Vietnam War, but confidence in the American government, and in particular in President Johnson, was being chipped away, chip, 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 chip. And the Tet Offensive really marked kind of a turning point and it was after that significant portions of Americans turned against supporting the war. And so from the North Vietnamese standpoint, the Tet Offensive really marked a strategic victory. So because it led to increased American domestic opposition to U.S. involvement in Vietnam, that was a tremendous strategic victory for North Vietnam. And the fact of the matter was, while President Nixon, once he was elected in 1968, and then pursued during the first few years of his presidency, what he called the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War, meaning the idea that America was going to pull out and the South Vietnamese were going to pursue the war without at least on the ground American support. It was pretty clear, I think, that the South Vietnamese were not going to be able to defend themselves, and the Tet Offensive, I think, showed that the North Vietnamese could invade the South, like I said, 100 cities and towns and military sites, including Saigon and Hue, even with American, ground troops there, and American control of the skies. I think led a lot of people to conclude that the South Vietnamese on their own were not going to be able to prevail, and yet. So in essence, America was kind of on the losing side, if you will. The other thing that happened was President Lyndon B. Johnson's approval rating just collapsed, at least partly as the result of what happened in the Tet Offensive. And it collapsed so dramatically that in March of 1968, Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election as president. So if you recall, Johnson became president after President Kennedy was assassinated. He finished the last part of Kennedy's term, but according to the Constitution, because he filled out less than half of Kennedy's term and then served one elected term himself, he was eligible to run for another term in office. But Johnson concluded that his approval rating was so bad, it did not make sense for him to run for re-election. Now, you might have said, well, gosh, backing out March of 1968 when the election was in November, that what good did that do? Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is elections were a lot shorter then than they are now. So in many ways, Johnson's action was a statesman-like move. I think that was part of his motivation, was to say, okay, clearly the American people do not want me to run again. He even said, I need to concentrate on the matters at hand, and not be, barnstorming the country in a re-election bid. So that too was somewhat of a strategic victory for the North Vietnamese, because Johnson had been such a strong supporter of the war, and he was among that segment of the Democratic Party that supported the war. And by Johnson choosing not to run, the anti-war part of the of the Democratic Party, the George McGovern wing of the party, really was able to become ascendant in many ways, and as a result, a huge section of the American population essentially joined the anti-war camp. And as well, the Tet Offensive and the dynamics that it started really set the stage for the eventual peace talks and finally the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam, which of course ended. And if you've ever seen the iconic images of helicopters rescuing people from the rooftops of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon as the final Americans left South Vietnam, and essentially shortly thereafter, North Vietnam invaded the South. They defeated the South Vietnamese army. They deposed the South Vietnamese government, and Vietnam was united under what was the communist Vietnamese government of the North, and into one country again, just of Vietnam. And it is, by the way, speaking of the tactical losses but strategic wins, it is interesting to note how things have played out over the succeeding half plus century, in that what was feared was Vietnam would come under the sway of communist China, and really become part of that bloc. But actually that didn't happen. Although communist China supported North Vietnam during the war, and provide materiel, logistical support, and even non-combat troops, roughly over 300,000, I think about 300,000, 320,000 non-combat troops in North Vietnam. When Vietnam invaded Cambodia, that was not to China's liking. And indeed, China wanted to avoid direct conflict with the United States, as had happened in Korea. And North Vietnam actually ended up aligning itself closer with Russia. And Russia and China were not on the best of terms at that point. And so the sort of alliance between Vietnam and China never really materialized in the way that the United States had feared. And in fact, here we are, like I said, more than a half a century later, or a half century later, I should say, and Vietnam has strong economic ties with the United States. Some of the decoupling of manufacturing between the United States and China is moving to Vietnam, which is considered a friendlier environment in which the United States is doing business. And there, if you followed any news, you've seen there have been sort of reconciliation reunions between Americans and Vietnamese troops against whom they fought, etc. So, from Vietnam's perspective, the strategic defeat by the North Vietnamese at Tet, or in Tet, really led to a long-term strategic victory, both militarily and economically for the country. Whereas China has essentially taken over Hong Kong and made it a part of mainland China in a way that was not supposed to be happening, at least for another roughly 20 years or so. Vietnam remains a strongly independent country from China, and really, I think has, as much concern about China as does, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, etc., which really redounds to the benefit of the United States and all of these other countries that I named. So, So this is the history of the Tet Offensive. And sorry, I keep glancing over there because I've been hearing a noise and it's all of a sudden heating up in my house, which, given what's going on here in Los Angeles, seems a little bit creepy. But I don't smell any fire, so I think I'm okay. So I've distilled 5 lessons from the Tet Offensive that we can apply to our business and professional lives, and I'm not in necessarily any order of importance, but things I think we should keep in mind as we run our businesses. So first of all, again, this question of the tactical wins versus strategic losses, or really tactical losses versus strategic wins, which is really what the Tet Offensive shows us. So from the South Vietnamese and the U.S. perspective, we won tactically, but we lost the war strategically, right? And South Vietnam as an entity eventually went away. Now, and so the short-term strategic picture for the United States was we suffered a military defeat. It was an embarrassment, and it led to kind of a malaise in the United States that really didn't lift until President Reagan, won the presidency. But the reality is, tactical wins and losses aren't nearly as important as strategic wins and losses. So the tactical win by the United States, although there was a short-term loss, led to a long-term strategic win. And more so for the North Vietnamese, although they lost tactically, their strategic victory was both kind of a shorter term strategic victory and essentially winning the Vietnam War, and what turned into strong economic ties with the United States over the long term. So when we look at what happens in our businesses and professional practices, we are sometimes going to suffer tactical defeats, and that's just a factor of how business works, right? What we need to do is keep our eye on the long game. Now that can be tough to do, especially if you're in a publicly traded company where you have to report quarterly earnings, and the analysts are all looking at that very closely, or if you're a company that's funded by VCs or even angel and seed capital, where you've got people scrutinizing what you're doing very thoroughly, keeping close tabs on you. One of the lessons is to remind those investors that a tactical loss doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to meet your strategic objectives. The two are not nearly as closely associated as we think they are. And you see this, for example, when, for example, a pharmaceutical company, they don't pass a particular test with the FDA. I kept thinking FAA, which is not the wrong one. With the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, right? They'll have some kind of experimental drug that they've applied for approval. It doesn't pass some test, and oftentimes you'll see the stock drop on that for that particular pharmaceutical company. So the fact of the matter is, failing that one particular test doesn't necessarily mean anything with respect to the longer term prospects for either that particular drug or for the company itself, right? So we need to look beyond tactical losses and by the way, passing the test doesn't necessarily mean that a drug is going to be successful unless the test is final approval. Well, and even then, just because a drug gets final approval doesn't mean it's going to be, it's going to be successful in the marketplace. So I think we need to look beyond tactical wins and losses in our businesses and professional practices, and understand those things from a operational and strategic perspective. Okay, and that's the main thing, and that's why it's important to have strategic goals. Okay, or what I call conditions of success. Okay, because conditions of success let us know that we're on track or off track, but on a continuum basis, rather than, well, I missed this, short-term objective. Oh no, what am I going to do? Okay, or I lost this client. Oh no, what am I going to do? Okay, it's good to develop a long view and then adjust that long view as necessary based on strategic wins and losses. Okay, next is the power of strategic surprise. So, or even tactical surprise. In the case of the Tet Offensive, it was launched during Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, which again was a time normally that there was a truce. Okay, and so neither the South Vietnamese nor the U.S. forces were expecting any kind of offensive by the NVA and the VC. And so as a result, the North Vietnamese forces were able to gain some early tactical advances, and there was concern, of course, that this was very, very serious, right? And oh no, what are we going to do? Okay, so while in the end the North Vietnamese tactically did not succeed, this is a good lesson, and it's something that we in business should really take a look at. So there's a tendency, for example, to not do things in the summer. Like the summer is kind of the doldrums of the business season, right? To launch new initiatives maybe after the first of the year, or or during, pardon me, the holiday season. Okay, but there may be an advantage to launching a product when nobody else is launching products, or to, for example, release a movie when most other distributors are not releasing a movie, because we have a lot less competition. If we do it well, we might be able to gain a lot more attention, because all the noise of other companies competing with us is reduced, if not eliminated, by looking at a time when this is not typically done, right? So this is, something to think about. And the example I mentioned, I think, about movies being released. So we tend to see new movies released in the summer for the big summer season, and at the holiday season toward the end of the year. Those are the two biggest movie-going times of the year, right? But if you've got some kind of media project, maybe releasing it in the spring, or the sort of late winter, early spring, or in the fall makes more sense when there's much less competition from other forms of media, like movies, like even these days, even the network television schedule is not nearly as important as it used to be. When I was much younger, you had the new fall lineup. That was a big thing. You didn't want to compete against that. But these days, maybe that's not quite as important. But for your particular business, if you're thinking of launching some kind of strategic initiative, what time of the year is kind of the dead time, and what kind of gains could you expect by pursuing your initiative then, when there is much less or no competition, how might that work out to your benefit? So the power of strategic surprise. Okay. Next is the importance of perception. So although the South Vietnamese and the Americans won the Tet Offensive, for all, I mean, they did. The North Vietnamese really made little territorial gains. They had huge personnel losses, but in some way, especially the United States, the Tet Offensive was looked at as an American loss. Okay, we were so badly surprised. The brutality that was on display by South Vietnamese forces, the fact that Americans came to conclude that our government was not telling us the truth with respect to what was happening in the Vietnam War. All of those made it feel to a lot of Americans like we lost the Tet Offensive, even though, in fact, tactically we won. And so these perceptions in the end loomed larger than the reality. And that's why the North Vietnamese won this strategic victory, right? And so in our businesses, in our professional practices, how we're perceived is as important as what the reality is, especially in the kind of media-drenched environment in which we live. And even for a small business or a small practice, when you have Yelp reviews and Google reviews and all these kind of things, they can have a very big impact on our businesses. Even though, we're not whatever, Coca-Cola or AT&T or whatever, okay? We're not some big, huge company, but people do check those Yelp reviews. And so as we run our businesses and professional practices, we really need to keep an eye out for how are the other I don't like this word so much, but stakeholders, the other, the customers, investors, employees, how are all of them perceiving our businesses? How are they perceiving our leadership? And so having an effective communications and PR strategy is very, very important in order to manage those perceptions. So if you're in a business where people, let's say you're in a restaurant business where people post online reviews about your food and the quality of your service and such, whether you want to or not, you really ought to be following those reviews and or have someone following them for you. And if you get a negative review, respond to it, reach out to the people and see what could be done to get them to maybe take the review down or post a retraction or something like that. So perception is important. There's no excuse me, there's no denying that. I think I cut off the last part of that in order to avoid coughing. Okay. Next is we need to know our audiences. So one of the things the North Vietnamese recognized is while they probably were not going to defeat U.S. military forces in Vietnam, they didn't necessarily need to. What they needed to do was gain not control, but create a shift in U.S. public opinion against the war. They didn't even need U.S. public opinion to be favorable to North Vietnam. And indeed, U.S. public opinion was not favorable to North Vietnam. It was against being involved in the war, right? But that was enough to eventually force the withdrawal of U.S. forces and allow the North Vietnamese to be successful. And in fact, although I wouldn't describe the North Vietnamese effort as a guerrilla war, this is the point of guerrilla warfare in general, and especially terrorist activity. It's to so demoralize your opponent that they want to give up the fight rather than keep suffering the losses that are necessary in order to gain victory, right? And so when we look at our businesses and our professional practices, okay, we need to know who are our crucial constituents. Okay, is it our customers? Yes, to some degree. Is it our employees? Yes, to some degree, right? Our shareholders, our suppliers, right? So, who among those groups are the keys to the success of our business? Now, you might say, well, all of them are. Well, yes and no. The fact of the matter is, for a large company like McDonald's, no single employee is really key to their success. Okay. Really, McDonald's employment model is to provide enough employee satisfaction that they'll always be able to have enough employees to, run the restaurants, either the company owned ones or the franchisee owned one. Okay. Indeed, getting customers to come in is more important than then having employees. Now, there's a balance there, because poor employees, would discourage customers from coming in, but employees can be replaced with automated ordering stations. For example, I saw those when I was in Israel. Okay, and so McDonald's audience, first and foremost, is its customers. Okay, suppliers too can be changed. No individual supplier is probably that important. And you might say, well, no individual customer is important. Well, that's true to a certain extent, but customers as a group are the most important constituent of McDonald's. So where is that in your business? So I can tell you, in my business, one of the very difficult aspects of it is navigating the reality that there's a small number of judges who operate in the probate courts, and to alienate one of those judges could be disastrous, really, for a professional fiduciary like me, or for a probate attorney, because if the judge doesn't like you, it's inevitably you're gonna have another matter in front of that judge, and now you're starting with kind of one arm tied behind your back. On the other hand, we act as fiduciaries, and so to let a judge get away with a ruling that's clearly not in the best interest of an estate, or the beneficiaries to an estate, really puts I know, for me, it puts me at odds with how I perceive my fiduciary duty. And in fact, I have a situation like that coming up later this week, and it's while the judges are my audience in that sense, the real crucial audience for me is actually the beneficiaries. Okay, because if I fail to fulfill my fiduciary obligation to them, and they complain, I could lose my license. So it's a difficult line to walk, and I received an email just before this broadcast that maybe in this particular case, the situation is going to get resolved. So I don't have to walk that line later this week. But I may. And if so, I'm going to have to let the lawyers know, look, here's what's going on. And my fiduciary duty is X. And so I'm going to have to either you as my representatives are going to have to let the judge know X, Y, and Z, or I'm going to speak up and say, Your Honor, I'd like to speak, and I'm going to have to say X, Y, and Z myself. So it is important to know your audience and to really know your audience. So knowing them and knowing their sensibilities, knowing how they'll receive messages. All of these are crucial to knowing not only who your audience is, but how to speak to them in a way that will motivate them to act or to perceive things in a way that is beneficial to you and your business or professional practice. Okay, finally, and I think we've talked about this on shows before, but I do want to wrap up with this, and that is the value of resilience. So the North Vietnamese suffered tremendous losses in the Tet Offensive. As I mentioned a while back, to the point where the VC basically were not much of a fighting force thereafter. And yet, they stayed in the fight and eventually won the war, and even more so have become economic partners with the United States, which was their military enemy half a century ago, right? So that kind of resilience is what it takes to work through challenges and eventually achieve success. And this is absolutely true in our businesses as well. We have to know we are going to suffer defeats. We are going to have setbacks. Okay. And this is why it's so important that we have our conditions of success, our long-term objectives, so that we can learn from those defeats and build more toward or keep going toward our conditions of success and our long-term objectives. Without resilience, it is unlikely that we're going to meet those long-term objectives. And so, we need to be building resilience always. And look, I'll be the first one to admit there are times when I want to throw my hands up and just I'm done. I'm done. I've had that happen in my life. Many times I felt, absolutely defeated. Sometimes, I just had to take some times to metaphorically lick my wounds before I could re-engage. Other times, through the help of friends and loved ones, I've been able to turn around my mindset relatively quickly and bounce back and continue the fight, so to speak. And this is why it's so important to have close colleagues, to have close friends with whom we can talk about defeats and get some empathy, not just the sort of raw, well, just turn it around and blah 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 blah. Most of us, we can't turn it around on a dime. That's not a character flaw. What it is normal human, behavior, if you will. But what's most important is that we develop strong relationships where people will, during these times, give us some support while we work through back to a place of resiliency. Give us some understanding and some encouragement without giving us necessarily the old raw talk with what my friend Michael and I call toxic positivity. There are people perhaps who never get down. I've never met anyone like that, frankly, and I think it's better for us to acknowledge our defeats, and work through the lessons and then move on stronger. That's part of building resilience, and that's certainly what the North Vietnamese did after the Tet Offensive. And it's what we all need to learn to do in order to be successful. So just real quickly, I want to reiterate the 5 lessons. Tactical wins and losses don't necessarily mean anything about longer term strategic wins, right? The two are not necessarily coupled, and we need to keep that in mind. Number 2, there's a power in strategic or tactical surprise, and we should try and take advantage of that. Third, we need to be aware of the importance of perceptions. Reality isn't always the most important thing. Next, we need to know our audiences, know who is our audience, know our most important audience, and what are they all about. And then finally, we need to know the value of resilience, that ability to bounce back after the inevitable setbacks. So those are the lessons that I've gleaned from what happened in the Tet Offensive, like I said, 57 years ago. So if you have any thoughts, comments, criticisms, my links to social media will be in the show notes after this episode posts. I invite you to make them, and always interested to hear what you have to say. So that's the show for today. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time, tomorrow Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, is my show, People Making Money. And I'm going to be talking about, let me get the exact title of the show, because I spent some time figuring this out. Yes, Adapt or Founder. So AI is a big force in business, and I think we need to figure out ways to use it productively rather than ignore it. I'm going to talk about 3 ways that AI makes my business and professional practice more productive, and hopefully that'll stimulate some ideas for you. And then on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my show, Jiggers' Place. We're going to have a cocktail, as we always do, as we head toward the end of the week, and talk about one of the classic adventure tales, Ivanhoe. You'll see it'll touch a little bit, or not a little bit. It will touch more fully on what I was talking about earlier today about the value of reading classic literature. And so I hope you'll join me at Jiggers' Place. And by the way, if you want the cocktail recipes, please go to my website, bemmel.com. Scroll all the way down to the bottom and sign up for my email list, and then you will get the cocktail recipe earlier that day, and you can mix up the cocktail with me, and we can enjoy it together while we talk, at least this Thursday, about great books. So thank you so much for joining me, especially those of you joining me live. Appreciate you tuning in, and wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Signing off as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friend.